Greetings, class. Today we're going to tackle the topic of the sexual marketplace. And for this chapter, we're going to review and we're going to analyze complex cultural, social, individual aspects of sex trade workers and their clients. Um, we'll also look at summarizing various aspects of pornography, including definitions, right? Distinctions between pornography and erotica, and the research on the effects of pornography, and discuss the global problem of child pornography and trafficking. But before we get to types of prostitution, and pornography, I wanted to read you a little bit again from my new favorite book, Sexy Origins and Intimate Things. I feel like I'm plugging this book. I promise I don't make any money off of this. I just thought you'd find it interesting. Okay, so this section is called The First Prostitute, Gilgamesh, from 2000 BCE Babylon. So Gilgamesh is one of the great classics of Babylonian literature, one of the earliest recorded poems. Gilgamesh, a hero of the epic, right, referring to the poem, was a legendary Mesopotamian king, and the narrative poem about his exploits, completed about 2000 BCE, it contains an account of a great flood, strikingly similar to the biblical flood. The epic also contains the first written account of prostitution. So at the time of Gilgamesh is supposed to have lived people in the not new, Near East, rather, still worshipped sacred prostitutes. According to one story told in the epic, Gilgamesh was harassing a rival city by capturing their sons for his army and their daughters for sexual pleasures, including marriage. Um, the oppressed people prayed to their god, who scooped up clay of the earth and created a new man, a warrior named Enkidu, a fit rival to Gilgamesh. Now, Enkidu is described as an innocent wild man and nearly invincible, and Gilgamesh, fearful of defeat, decides to weaken his rival by tempting with a temple prostitute. So once the newly created man, in quotes, lost his sexual innocence through intercourse with a woman, he would be weak, human, and vulnerable. The similarities with Adam and Eve's fall in the Garden of Eden are striking, right? Very similar types of stories. Thus, a beautiful temple prostitute is sent to Enkidu, who's mesmerized by her. Here's an excerpt from the poem. She untied her loincloth and opened her legs, and he took possession of her comely. She used no restraint, but accepted his ardor. She put aside her robe, and he lay upon her. He used on him the savage, a woman's wiles. His passion responded to her. For 6 days and 7 nights, Enkidu approached and coupled with the prostitute. And there was harm from too much sex. It weakened and corrupted Enkidu. Sex also gave him forbidden knowledge. Sounds familiar again, right? So after he was sated with her charms, he set his face toward his game. But when the gazelles saw him, Enkidu, they ran. The game of the steep fled from his presence. Enkidu tried to hasten after them, but his body was, as it were, bound. His knees failed him, who tried to run after his game. Enkidu had become weak. His speed was not as before, but he had intelligence. Wide was his understanding. That sounds similar too. After Gilgamesh defeats Enkidu in a trial of strength, the two men become best of friends. The legend, which contains the first exotic verse in Western literature, also contains several sexist themes that survive to this day. Women designed to ensnare men, and sex with a woman weakens a man. And the most desirable and dangerous is that woman is a beautiful young prostitute. Yeah. All right. So this is an old theme, right? We're talking about prostitution. And I thought I would share with you, let me share my screen with you for starters. As we talk about the sexual marketplace, I'm going to get into sometimes what's called the oldest profession, referring to prostitution, right? And wonder about maybe what the oldest brothel looks like. This is something we have pictures of. So Salonika in ancient Rome, over 1,000 years ago. Here's a picture of it if you want to see it. Here, like, sexual services were exchanged for virtually anything. They had a barter system. But then later, not just a bartering system, there's actually currency created. Okay, here's some artwork depicted on the walls. I think they're just playing Twister is what I think. I don't know. No, of course. They're highly sexual artwork. There's another painting, right? And here's the currency I was looking for earlier. So, historically, prostitution's been thought of and often legally defined as acts furnished by a female to a male, right? But here, you can see how old these are, and how long this has been going on with these ancient Roman forums. This currency, I was reading about it. So this one was specifically made, just to use with prostitutes, like just for sex, like nothing else. And it was the most, valuable currency, really of its time, like more so than food, for example. So, can show you economically, what price they put on on prostitution and that as a profession. Kind of interesting, right? So it's nothing new for humans. The act of trade, right? Sex for trade, bartering, or actual currency, actual money. All right, now today, of course, we can look at this in all types of maybe more complicated ways with the advent of technology, right? But the same types of behaviors typically. So I'm going to break this up into two parts. We'll look at pornography in this first video, and then we'll look at sex trade workers and their clients in the second. So in this first one, let's jump into pornography. And I thought I would share with you, um, it's a little bit outdated, but I'm going to share with you some statistics about pornography. But before we get to those stats, which I think you'll find interesting and just almost like fun to look at, honestly, but before we do that, we got to define pornography. Like, what is it? A lot of people say they can recognize it when they see it, but when trying to give an actual definition, it's really tough to do. Right. So, if we're always searching for this definition, especially for legal reasons. The classic definitions are kind of like something like this: any sexually explicit work deemed obscene according to legal criteria. But that's highly subjective, right? And then you get these tautological types of definitions or fallacies in our law as they pertain to pornography. I'm like, so what is obscene, right? Well, that's the gray area. Now we have to talk about that, right? Where's the line between art and obscenity, right? From classic types of debates, and does that get into like some kind of setting a moral standard about the First Amendment in particular? Does the First Amendment, does it protect pornography, right? It protects other types of art. Is pornography different? And then is there a discrimination standard based on this moral argument? Do you not like it because, or do you think those people that make the laws would make certain types make pornography illegal just because they don't like it? But what about people that do? It's a tricky gray area. I don't see how it cannot be a gray area. So it's an interesting one, difficult to define, and highly subjective. Yeah. So that's what I was talking about. Does say we made all pornography illegal, would that be an issue of the First Amendment? And are we trying to apply a subjective moral standard onto everybody, make those that make pornography, those that consume pornography, right? Are we trying to imply a moral standard onto those people that may not be their sense of morality? So it's a complicated issue, and it's hard to figure out if you're looking at pornography or erotica or if it's art or not, right? Okay. So let's look at, this is a little bit old now. This is from 2017. So it's a few years old, but one thing that's interesting about like a lot of like pornography websites is they hire analysts, right? So if you're good with statistics, they're interested, in potentially hiring you to work for them because they're a business and they want to know, what people are looking at, when they're looking at it, how long are they looking at it? Like they want to know all this information because they have to decide, okay, we're generating ad revenue. So where do we place our ads? How does that work? And who are we trying to advertise toward? Like who is looking at different types of porn and for how long and when during the day or night, when during the week, right? And how much, all these types of questions, right? So it's really interesting if you even do a Google search for like Pornhub statistics, you can get a whole year in review. So here's one for the year 2017. So it's a little old, forgive me for that, but you can go look up like last year's statistics. I think they're already up. right? But this will blow your mind. And these numbers have only increased, right? But if we look at just Pornhub, like it's not all porn on the internet, but Pornhub is a website. If you don't know what that is, some of you are pretending you don't know what that is, but that's okay too, right? Oh, they get 28.5 billion annual visits to Pornhub. So 28.5 billion with a B, right? That's 81 million daily visits. So that means sometimes it's a little more than 81 million, sometimes it's a little less, but it's 81 million on average per day. That's amazing, right? Okay, so I'll just read some of these too. We got like 25 billion searches are performed in 2017. That's just searches, different types of searches. 50,000 searches per minute, 800 searches per second. And there's over 4 million videos uploaded in a year to Pornhub. And then the hours of Pornhub uploaded, this one always gets me too. So there's like, 68 years worth of pornography viewed in 1 year, right? That's over 24,000 days, over nearly 600,000 hours worth of material. It's just wild, man. It's just so much. Okay. I grabbed some other stats. This is all from the report, by the way. They made these images, so I just copied and pasted these. It was so easy. I just sorted through things that you guys might find interesting. So another thing I learned is that some of the language we get, in the tech world was really created to handle how much data is being interacted with pornography. It was so big, they had to create new terminology, right? So the data transferred per year is over 3,000, almost 4,000 petabytes, right? And that's over 10 million gigabytes per day, right? I mean, it's like 118 gigabytes per second of pornography. It says here it's enough data to fill the memory of every iPhone currently used around the world. So videos voted in 2017 was 120 million videos voted on. It's wild. Here's another one I took that didn't have an image for, but I took it out of their report. That was that every 5 minutes, Pornhub transmits transmits more data than the entire contents of the New York Public Library's 50 million books. That's every 5 minutes, more data is transferred than the entire library in New York. Over the course of 2017, there are 120 million video votes on Pornhub, of which nearly 80% were positive. That's a million votes more than was cast in the last U.S. presidential election. So there's more people voting. I mean, do you get that? There's more people voting on pornographic videos on Pornhub than there are people that vote in presidential elections. So if you thought porn wasn't a big deal in our culture, it clearly is, right? So this comes, I wanted to give you, a citation for this from the doctor who's a sex therapist and director of the Pornhub Sexual Wellness Center. Bet you didn't know they had one of those, right? So they do some of this data crunching. They also teach classes there about sexual pleasure, about anatomy, about all types of different topics, which is pretty interesting and not what people think of when they just think about Pornhub in general, but they have like an educational center. Okay, so the searches that defined 2017. So these are some of it's either the top trending search throughout the year, and some of that are like specific to 2017 itself. So number one was porn for women, which is really interesting. There's some qualitative research out there that women like looking at porn for women, but so do a lot of men for lots of different reasons. But when surveyed those men that searched for it specifically, what they said they liked about it was it looked like the people were actually emotionally involved with each other. It wasn't really rough. It looked consensual from both parties, that kind of thing. It looked like two people having sex who were just like really good at having sex for long periods of time and who were good looking people. So they didn't think it looked particularly like, I suppose you could say to them, it looked more erotic, certainly not obscene. So they were like, not interested in looking up obscene pornography, which is interesting, right? For that to be the number one in 2017. Rick and Morty's number two. I don't know. I'm not sure. I think that's one that's just specific to 2017. Number three is the fidget spinner. Like those were really big in 2017. So keep that in mind. I know now that fad is kind of gone. Um, I know some of you are going to go do searches on that one right away, thinking, how is that incorporated, right? But it's as you can imagine it was incorporated. Oh, there you go. Um, whether it was kind of balanced on like the head of a penis or on top of a clit, or if it was in the back of a plug or a dildo of some kind with a spinner on the back. So it's kind of funny, novelty kind of thing. Moving on, you got 1080p, so people want to see high definition. ASMR was pretty new around this time, or at least taken off. And I always forget what that stands for. I have to look it up every time. But it's basically auditory stimulation. Right? So people have really hot microphones, kind of like mine. But if I turn this up really loud so that I had to whisper and you could hear everything in my mouth, like all the saliva and all that. For some people, that's just relaxing. And for some people, it's sexual. So that's an interesting one. For me, it just grosses me out. I hate that sound. But to each their own, right? And then you got hentai, which is animated porn, but more specifically like Japanese animated pornography, and then cheerleaders, right? Number 7. So top trending search throughout the year, increasing by over 1,400%. Let's move on. So the third year in a row is the most searched term. So people type in terms they're searching for. Lesbians, number 1. It's been there for 3 years in a row. And when they look at people who have accounts on Pornhub, then they see it makes sense because it's one of the categories that has the biggest mix of men and women. So it makes sense that it'd be the top trending or the top most searched item, right, worldwide. But then you've got hentai and MILF and stepmom. And then we start to get into like the incestuous kind of stuff: stepmom, stepsister, mom, teen, Japanese, and so on, right? Okay. Let's move on. What else do we have here? Okay, my gender. So if you were wondering, what about men and women? Are there differences? Are there similarities between what men and women are looking for? We can just look here, right? So the top search for women was lesbian, then lesbian scissoring, and then threesome, right? The top 3 for men was MILF, stepmom, Japanese. And then we get lesbian in there down about like number 6, right? 6 or 7. There you go. The top trending searches for 2017 by gender. This is kind of interesting. Cheerleader, top trending search for women. And for men in 2017, it was the fidget spinner. So we see who's looking for the fidget spinner. Doesn't even show up on the trending search for women. Okay, so the dudes are like interested in that, I suppose. They're also interested in gadgets more, so maybe that's it. But also, I mean, if that doesn't spark your curiosity, right away, maybe you want to go, what? I gotta go search for this fidget spinner thing. What are they talking about? Okay, most viewed categories by gender. Again, for women, you get lesbian, then you get threesome, then you got big dick, and you got popular with women and ebony. For men, the top viewed category was Japanese, and then ebony, and then MILF, and then mature. Interesting. I like this part in the graph on the bottom is interesting to me. Viewed more often by women compared to men. So of other things that women look at more than men, those are ranked here as well. So like pussy licking, number 1, popular with women, number 2, lesbian, number 3, right? And then gangbang, number 4, double penetration, number 5. So those are things that women were searching for at a higher rate than men. Interesting. Right? Proportion of female visitors. So you can look at this by country. Right, so you can see there's no kind of 50-50 split in like men and women looking at pornography. It's overwhelmingly male in just about every country, with the Philippines coming the closest, with there being 36% women who are looking at pornography on Pornhub compared to men. Where's the United States? Are we on there? There we are. So United States, 25% women and 75% men. Interesting, and it's up. It's increased by like 10%. So that's interesting. All right. So as you might have suspected, it looks like there are more men looking at porn than women. Here's a proportion of female visitors worldwide. If you want to look at that, where they've got approaching 50%, you just have a couple places. Looks like a couple places here in South America. And maybe, I think those are getting kind of pinkish over here, like in Eastern Europe. But the rest is just like kind of an average amount, and then blue is less. You actually have some countries where you have fewer women looking at porn compared to women in other countries. But see, most of it is purple. It's about an average amount, right? Okay, now, whoa, there's a lot on the screen. So popular by age group. Let's see. Most of you are in this first one, 18 to 24. So let's look at that. Those of you in the 18 to 24, looks like lesbians number one, and then hentai, right? And then stepmom, then MILF. Okay. Let me find, just for the fun, let me find my category. And there's a couple people my age in this. Oh, right here down the bottom. So for people my age, it's gonna be selfish. I want to know. We got Japanese, MILF, and lesbian, stepmom, mom. Huh. So kind of similar in that weird incestuous taboo thing, with the mom information on there. It's kind of weird. Oh, and in that regard, I did see the same study I was drawing from before. I talked about pornography, the qualitative data, when they asked men who were looking at like stepmom or mom pornography. They asked them questions like, does it really remind you of your mom? Or if it did, how would that feel? And blah, blah, blah. They did interviews for these. Most men, yeah, they said, no, I don't actually want to have sex with my mom. It would really kind of gross me out if I thought of my mom while I was masturbating, looking at porn. So I think it's just it's the difference between fantasy and reality there. All right. So we got some more stats for you. Here we go. Top 20 countries by traffic. I mean, this one, look at us. Look at the US. We're number one for looking at pornography, for sure, right? So we look at pornography uh, like exponentially more than most other countries, right? I mean, the only one that comes close is the United Kingdom, and they're about like a third of our look at porn, about a third as much as we do. Maybe I'm interpreting that wrong, because this is looking at Pornhub, so maybe they're using some other type of website instead. It's more popular where they are, potentially, right? But this would tell you, if you worked for Pornhub and you were trying to like boost your numbers in other countries, you could see, okay, where can we focus? Okay, and then what's working so well in the U.S., right? That kind of thing. What else we got here? Time spent per visit. So this is the duration of time spent on Pornhub. So on the top, you got the Philippines on average looking at about like 13 and a half minutes. And the US is about 10 and a half minutes. And then Russia's the very bottom for just under, 8, just between 7.5 and 8 minutes, right? So not like huge discrepancies in time there, but there are some differences. I guess interesting. Let's see, what else do we have here? Time spent per visit in the United States. Oh yeah, that's kind of fun. So if we look at just the US and the time spent looking at pornography, let's check that out. So it looks like Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, Louisiana, Arkansas, not all huge differences. Like they're like, one to throw them in there too. It's like from the 11 to 11 and a half minutes long, right? And then have the shortest, we can look at Kansas. Looks like the shortest time was like 9 minutes and 5 seconds. So not a huge difference between the shortest amount of time and the longest amount of time. Going from like 9 minutes to 11 and a half minutes being the range there. All right, interesting. Or being the minimum maximum scores with like a 1.5 minute range. How about this? Favorite times to watch pornography. So when is Pornhub the busiest? When do they have the most traffic? Well, it looks like here's the weekly average line going through the graph. Anything above the line is above average uses. So it looks like, what do we look here? About 10 p.m. to 1 a.m. So most people are looking. There's a little surge there around like between 3 to 5, which is also kind of interesting. It's a little bit of afternoon, but most of it in late night. And let's look at on the bottom here, we have a daily usage, right? So you can break it down by day and see when it's the busiest. So again, about 10 to midnight, doesn't matter the day so much. It's like on Saturday, people may be a little busier. But other than that, yeah, there's a lot of porn usage every night of the week. And the most popular day being Sunday, it looks like. Oh, I was wrong. Friday is the least popular day. And the most popular day is Sunday. I wonder why that is. Okay, so you guys, if you want to knock yourself out, you can go look at all the porn stats that you want to. There's a lot of them out there. And I encourage you to go explore those on your own. I don't mean go look at porn on your own. I mean, look at the stats. I mean, they're fascinating. All right. So at the beginning of this lecture, I was talking about, I just started talking about really, a definition of pornography, and the question becoming, is it pornographic or is it artistic? Or you might say, is it pornography or erotica? Erotica is often the word used um, when defining pornography as having some type of artistic merit, or not necessarily as obscene. So it's the same kind of debates we have all the time. These like very, very cognitive types of debates. It can be emotional too, but it's more about like, how do we consider this stimulus, right? Like, how do we categorize it? Are there two distinct categories, like category 1 pornography, category 2 erotica, or is it more of a sliding scale, right? Is it just how more or less pornographic something is, right? And that seems to be where a lot of people have difficult like assimilating or accommodating their called their cognitive schemas, right? Their networks of thoughts within their brain. But it's a tough one to answer because it's very subjective. One person's erotica is another person's pornography, right? So it's a tough one. But you can say, probably it's fair to say that erotica is if you see it as an art form, it's by one who is appreciative of the art. But with pornography, they are just kind of consuming pornography. Are they appreciative of its artistic merits? Maybe, but probably not. It's more like a means to an end, usually used during masturbation. So, but you might think of though as like the difference of like sexual sharing versus sexual using. I've heard that too from sex researchers, that erotica is more about sharing sensuality and sexuality, and pornography is more about using each other for sex. Um, those are the people's thoughts on the topic, though I should say that most researchers um, today, they do draw a distinction between pornography um, in which men or women are used and victimized, typically by men, but sometimes by women as well. And erotica, kind of as shown here in this picture, which will desire an equality in sexual activities, even though the sexual content may still be equally explicit, right? All right, so what are the effects of pornography? So, I mean, there's lots of different ways we can look at this. We can get really nitpicky with some of the studies. I've mentioned before, there's studies where people look at pornography that is kind of disgusting to them, where people are doing things that they deem like morally reprehensible, or that they just think they're gross and not for them. They actually don't have as strong of an arousal response in either men or women. It tends to be a bit stronger in men across the board. But if they're looking at something that they don't like, then they don't automatically get the same arousal responses. So some original studies said that men and women did, but through all the meta-analyses that have been done now, which is a collection of studies put together on the topic, they find out, yeah, there's like a slight increase or a slight arousal response, um, but not very strong, right? For looking at something you find disgusting. Well, that kind of makes sense, right? Um, we can say that research has shown that women tend to be, sexually aroused by explicit sexual scenes of all sexual orientations, a bit more than men. So looking at homosexual scenes between two women or two men is slightly more arousing for women than it is for men. Across the board, men tend to be aroused by kind of like what coincides with their sexual orientation. Now, the exception, of course, for that is bisexual men who are attracted to both men and women. But men primarily aroused by depictions of their own kind of personal sexual orientation. So that's kind of interesting, I suppose. You do with that information what you will. It kind of fits with a lot of the sexual theories and the differences between men and women, with women's ideas of sexuality and gender being a bit more fluid and men's being a bit more rigid. So I'm not really surprised by those results about pornography. So let's look at there's some other like benefits. There's some benefits of pornography too. It can be helpful for people that have arousal, issues. It can just be it can be fun for people on their own. It can be fun for couples, right? So it can help like enhance stimulation. So all those things can be good. Some people even like to try to copy or mimic what they're seeing. Um, that's funny. I read one study about that when couples did that, and what both men and women were surprised by when watching like full scenes in pornography. They're like, I can't believe how long the oral sex lasts. Pardon me, and how short the actual coitus is if they're watching heterosexual sex. So that's kind of funny, right? Just kind of an anecdote from those studies. But there's not only positive effects of pornography, like anything, and I think in life there's potential to maximize the positive. There's also that potential to maximize the negative, right? So we can look at some of that as well. Some of the most obvious, might pop out to you. The effects of pornography would be that potentially discriminating against women, kind of perpetuating the myth that they are only objects to be pursued, kind of like a conquest, right? And then the theme of like consent, where this woman may say no, but eventually kind of giving in to primal physical sexual urges, and just once you get started, and then you would enjoy it no matter what, that kind of thing. That can be a dangerous narrative, I think, to set. So I get that. And then certainly from like the industry standpoint, you can't tell typically from watching pornography. Does that woman want to be there? Is it consensual, or do they feel coerced or trapped, or they have no other skills, and so they're doing something against their will just for the money? And then is that bad? A lot of people have jobs they do just for money they don't like, right? So it gets into these weird types of questions about ethics and morality. But I know, I mean, I don't know this for sure. I haven't seen enough studies. It'd be interesting to see if men watched a scene of pornography and were told later that woman did not consent to that scene, right? And kind of see like how they feel about that. I imagine most men wouldn't like that very much. Like, so they have this fantasy in their head that all the women in that scene want to be there, right? And then of course extend that fantasy, and maybe those women want to do that with you as well, right? I think some men get mixed up with fantasy and reality. Women too, but since more men are looking at porn, I'm talking about them. So certainly perpetuating discrimination against women, saying this is the new norm. This is how you treat women sexually, like they do in pornographic films. I hope that people understand that that is fantasy and not real. And in fact, some pornography, most women are not even capable of doing, right? So important to point that out. It has to do with adjusting or setting your sexual expectations. And then there's the effects of pornography, as it presents itself as novel, right? So there's a widespread use of internet porn, and most young boys, seek out porn on the internet around age 10 when they first see it. I mean, like first look for it on their own. This comes from, I always say the guy's name wrong, but Leguanese, I think, in 2009. It found that internet pornography is much more compelling than pornography of the past because of its unending novelty. Right, so that's different. Even pornography in the past, if you were looking at a magazine, typically, or maybe on television, right, or if you have that like cable, you have that back when I was like young or a teenager, that scrambled channel, like the adult channel that you couldn't really see it, like the television was all scrambled, but once in a while the image would pop out clear, or sometimes the audio was fine, it was just the visual information that was all blurred out. But then you didn't have control of novelty in that case, at least not at the same frequency, right, not at the same rate, Whereas on your phone, it's like swiping, right, left, start, stop, find a new video, close the old one, right? You can look at, thousands and thousands of different types of pornographic scenes. So um, they find this type of behavior in other animals, and they call it the Coolidge effect, right? When novelty is introduced. But there's been a few studies where they looked at men and pornography and found kind of the same thing they do with like different types of cattle when it comes to breeding. And this spike we're showing right here in this graph, right? So in yellow here, see this spike? This is when men were shown porn they hadn't seen before. So there's an increase in, it's made of two things. It's the penile circumference and subjective arousal levels, which is kind of interesting overall when you look at the graph, that the kind of objective measure of penile circumference to the subjective measure, like, reporting your arousal levels, they seem to be pretty much in line, right? The blue and the red line in the graph seem to be moving close to parallel. But what's interesting, okay, so you get the circumference. So this is, we just call this arousal, right? So the arousal level is high. And as you watch the same porn over and over again, the arousal level goes down, and you show a brand new type of porn as a stimulus, and boom, back up to those old arousal levels, right? And then it dips down again. All right, so we can measure this novelty approach. That's interesting, right? Now, let's compare that to, the same thing that you see in animals, as I mentioned before, the Coolidge effect, where it takes longer to reach ejaculation with the same stimulus. Now, this is for like sheep when they're studied. Switching females leads to faster refractory periods. So that's interesting too, right? So they're going to mix around as much as they can, like breeding stock, like if you were to work on a farm, right, to increase just the frequency of coupling or husbandry, as they might call it, but basically ejaculation, right? So for men watching pornography, each new female that comes onto the screen is like this new fantasy mate opportunity, right? At least that's how our brain sees it. So you get, these spikes of dopamine along with those subjective arousal and penile circumference levels. And that's a huge motivator for behavior. Dopamine, I mean, huge motivator for behavior. So the more novelty in pornography now than ever in human history. And now almost people in my classes, it was just around since they've been born, been accustomed to like this constant novelty at an extremely fast rate. So that leads to the questions like, what does that mean for the future? Does that change things for us? There's all the joke there too that this researcher made in his paper. Like, are we the first generation to masturbate left-handed? Ha 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 ha. Right, but I get what he's saying. Like, it means, like, we don't know what this means necessarily for the future, but we see some effects already. Right, so um, the type of behavior, like the exposure to novelty like that, and the huge spikes in dopamine, is rewarding to the pleasure centers and reward pathways in our brain, but the stimulus isn't, the thing is, it isn't realistic, right? It's just stimulus. It just gets the dopamine going because it doesn't involve all the other things that we associate with, like dating, right, or courtship, and like touching each other first, like non-sexually. You can't smell anything. We're looking at porn like on your phone, your computer. There's not an emotional connection. There's no human interaction there. Really, it's all vicarious through these cameras and screens. Um, but you still get the stimulation of this dopamine, this dopaminergic reward pathway in your brain when you do look at pornography, and you see it decrease and decrease. Then you introduce novelty, and it spikes back up again. And that's essentially how you create like addiction, or what addiction looks like in the brain, right? It's like you start to build tolerance to something, and you need more, or you need more often of a stimulus to get that same spike again. And so you can get that for pornography as well as many other things, but pornography can be addictive for that reason. But it's hard to study pornography in something like effects that they're seeing now with arousal disorders, basically because it's hard to find a control group. Can you find college-aged men in particular, because of course these studies are all about men, right? But can you find college-aged men that don't look at pornography regularly? Almost can't find them, right? So it's hard to find that control group for comparison for these types of studies. So that's interesting, right? Um, the strongest stimulation of this dopamine reward system pathway for all internet activity is pornography. Back to that idea, and it's so readily available that it's no wonder you can't find this control group. But there has been some study about what they call like the binge mechanism um, when looking at pornography. It was probably like that binge mechanism that exists and just in general is probably beneficial for our ancient brain, right? But now, of course, we see that we don't need to think that way as much. Like we've evolved to be wired for things like, caloric intake. And that's why maybe we get so much obesity. It's also because there's so much more food everywhere and food that's not good for you and a diversity of foods. But you see it in drug use and, pornography as well. We've been talking about that. And then the excessive consumption, right, it leads to increases of dopamine and then to the binge mechanism called delta phos B, which accumulates and leads to more cravings for pornography. But this is the same with any addiction, right? And, it can lead to structural brain changes like a numbed pleasure response, hyperreactivity to porn. There are things like willpower erosion, with change in the prefrontal cortex activation. Same for all addictions like drugs and gambling, video games, right? Porn included. So I was looking at this study where they had ex-porn users, and now there may be something as close to a control group as we could get, which is where there are these sites online where there are like, at this point, like thousands of men giving up porn, and talking about that and, writing about it online. But well, most of them give it up, honestly. Some of them do because maybe they're strong willed, but most of them, they give it up because they have erectile dysfunction. So, that's when they decide, well, I'm giving up porn now. Okay, but because you have erectile dysfunction, right? So what they tried was these men who gave up porn because of erectile dysfunction, they started with sexual enhancement drugs. They typically didn't work for these men, which is interesting because their problem wasn't with blood flow to their genitals, right? It was with physical structures of the brain. So those medications don't really impact directly those physical structures in the brain. They're all about just increasing blood flow, like in general, and including to your reproductive organs, right? Your reproductive structures. So those didn't really work for these guys because their problem wasn't blood flow. The problem was, these exhausted reward pathways, right? So they started with, they'd have lower reactions to porn sites. They would report a general drop in libido and erectile dysfunction. Um, the page where they found most of these guys for this study, if you're curious, is called Fapstronauts, which is kind of funny, but they have over 15,000. I think last time I checked, it was closer to 16,000 members on Reddit. So it's like a Reddit group called the Fapstronauts. Interesting. They're men typically in their early 20s, and they aren't regaining their erectile health as fast as some of the older men. Now that was the surprising part, right? So for a lot of the older men, it would take them like 2 months of abstaining from internet pornography, just 2 months for the older guys, right? And then they would get kind of their arousal levels back. But for the younger men who you think would bounce back faster, that's typically the trend, it took them twice as long or over twice as long, so like 4 to 5 months after abstaining from internet pornography for their arousal problems or arousal disorders to kind of go away. So the widespread erectile dysfunction was really it was really not seen before internet porn. But people had erectile dysfunction, but not so many and not so young, right? So there's a difference between. You can also track it this way: difference between erectile dysfunction rates before and after high-speed internet became available. So the older guys didn't have the sexual problems because they weren't first looking at pornography with high-speed internet. So they didn't start off with this kind of novelty like the younger men did, is at least like the assumption made by the researchers on this topic. And now teens are looking at pornography even earlier than teens, right? Preteens looking at pornography with like excess novelty, high speed, and when their brains are at peak dopamine levels and neuroplasticity. So, there's potential danger there. Like we're maybe also already seeing some of those issues with arousal problems. But the good news is that, I mentioned neuroplasticity. That's just it. Your brains are plastic, so rewards and behaviors can be unlearned, they can be relearned, and arousal addiction um, can be maintained or even escaped. Right? Okay. So I think it's interesting to think about in regard to um, what do I want to say, pornography, or at least like sex that doesn't involve a living partner, is robotics. So this is a link. You guys can check this out in your own time if you want. If you go to Realbotics, so people who make sex dolls essentially, and they're becoming more and more kind of complex and complicated, and it leads to strange ethical questions, right? Like, are we creating sex slaves? Does that matter? I mean, does it matter for the robots? I mean, the, the is it fair to them if they advance so far that they can do all these complex sexual things? Does it mean that they have some kind of consciousness, or is the programming so good that we can't tell? We're far from that, by the way. But that's kind of the goal of this industry, which is kind of interesting. I think it was about 2 years ago now. There was this debate in Texas, and there's I forget what city it was now, but they wanted to open a shop like where they would sell these sex dolls, right? And there are all these laws about like how you can and can't advertise what you can and can't see from the street and that kind of thing. So once they got that part squared away and it looked like, yes, they could open, with these guidelines, and they were going to open their shop, people started protesting. And there were like three protests going on and counter protests at the same time, which is like ones you wouldn't expect. So there's people you would expect to come out and say, this is wrong. We don't want, sex robot shops in our town. It's like, okay. Right. So you expect those people to come out, other people that come out to combat them, to say, this is healthy, this is safe, they're, you can have sex with this robot. The only people can even afford them, you know, maybe it's better they act out their fantasies with this robot than with real people anyway, right? So they had all these arguments that were pro sex robot. And then you had the third group that came out, which really I don't think anybody anticipated. Those were to come out to say, think of the rights of the robots, right? So you got these three different groups protesting in the streets, and I think they decided just to scrap it and to not open the store at all. But you can go check it out. Look at the Real Robotics video that is linked, hyperlinked in this PowerPoint, if you want to see more information about that. Because that debate gets really deep, even into things like child pornography. Is it wrong to give a pedophile a child sex robot, that they can have sex with, and then they can feel sexually fulfilled, and then they don't have those urges in their daily life? Some people say, yeah, sure, why not? Other people say you're teaching same type of behavior, it's reinforcing it, so it's bad. It's an interesting debate, but go check out Realbotics and look at the robots for yourself. I imagine you'll find them not as sexy as you're imagining. Right? Okay, now with pornography, as we get into things like child pornography, there's, of course, it's illegal. Here's the federal law, right? Any image of a child under the age of 18 engaged in any sexually explicit conduct is illegal contraband. It doesn't matter if you're sharing it, it's been shared to you, it's illegal to have it. Even if somebody sent it to you as a message on your phone, you're breaking the law just by having it even receive that message, right? So it's not just people who are pedophiles, right? These images get passed around. Not often, but when they do, of course, you're breaking the law. So it's a crime to possess, receive, distribute, or produce child pornography. Okay. Hey, we'll come back with part two of this chapter on the sexual marketplace. So I'll be right back in a few moments, and we will talk about prostitution. All right, I'll see you then.